Hey there, travelers. Before we dive into today's story, drop a comment below telling us where you're tuning in from. Now let's begin our journey into the unknown. I found them in a water-stained cardboard box at an estate sale in Baltimore's Fells Point district. The old Victorian house had belonged to a collector named Theodore, who died 3 months earlier with no living relatives. His entire collection, 40 years of accumulated books, manuscripts, and what the auctioneer generously called curios, was being liquidated to pay his debts. The box hadn't even been catalogued. Someone had shoved it under a mahogany desk in the study, probably planning to inventory it later, and then forgetting it existed. I only found it because I was searching for my dropped pen, my fingers brushing against cardboard corners in the shadows. Inside were 12 loose pages, each roughly 8 inches by 6, the edges torn as if ripped from a larger volume. The paper was vellum, actual calfskin parchment that had been scraped, stretched, and treated with lime. I recognized the texture immediately. This wasn't reproduction. This was the real thing, probably 15th or 16th century based on the manufacturing technique. But it was the handwriting that stopped my heart. 16th century French script, dense and cramped in the margins, with quatrains written in a flowing hand I'd seen in only one other place. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where I'd spent 6 months studying Nostradamus's original manuscripts during my doctoral research. I paid the auctioneer $40 for the box without asking questions. Drove home with my hands shaking so badly I had to pull over twice. Sat in my car outside my apartment building for 20 minutes, just staring at the box in my passenger seat, trying to convince myself this wasn't what I thought it was. It couldn't be. Every known Nostradamus manuscript had been catalogued, analyzed, and cross-referenced. I'd written my dissertation on authenticating Renaissance prophecies. I'd spent years debunking fraudulent, lost prophecies that surfaced every few years, usually before someone tried to sell them at auction for 6 figures. This had to be another forgery. A good one, certainly. The parchment alone would have cost thousands to fake properly. But still a forgery. I carried the box up 3 flights of stairs to my apartment above Murray's used books. The building smelled like old paper and the Indian restaurant next door. Scents that had become so familiar, I barely noticed them anymore. My ex-wife used to complain about the smell, said it clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin, said I cared more about dead men's words than living people's needs. She wasn't wrong. My apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a 38-year-old historian between jobs. Cramped, cluttered, dominated by books. They lined every wall, stacked on every flat surface, teetered in precarious towers beside my second-hand desk. The desk itself was buried under research materials, photocopies, printouts, handwritten notes in my increasingly illegible scrawl. I cleared a space with one arm, sending an avalanche of papers cascading to the floor. Didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the box. I removed the pages one by one, laying them out in a line across my desk. 12 pages, each covered front and back with text. Some pages had water damage along the edges, rust-colored stains that might have been blood or might have been wine, impossible to tell without chemical analysis. Others were remarkably pristine, protected by whatever volume they'd been torn from. I grabbed my magnifying lamp, angling it over the first page. The vellum illuminated from behind, revealing the texture of the skin it had been made from. The faint patterns of pores and hair follicles visible even after 5 centuries. The handwriting was definitely Nostradamus's style. I'd memorized his peculiar way of forming letters during my research. The elongated S, the distinctive Q with its exaggerated tail, the tiny crosses he used as punctuation marks. This matched perfectly. But it was the content that made my mouth go dry. These weren't the familiar quatrains from Les Prophéties. These were new, unknown. And they all shared one terrifying commonality. They referenced the same year. L'année de 2 fois 13 cents, the year of twice 1300. I grabbed my calculator, hands trembling. Nostradamus used a peculiar dating system in his private writings, counting years from what he believed was the true birth of Christ. If you adjusted for his calendar system, twice 1300 would be 2026. Next year. I sat back in my chair, which creaked ominously under my weight. Outside my window, Baltimore continued its evening routine. Cars honking, people shouting, the distant wail of sirens, normal sounds, a normal night. December 30th, 2025, just another cold Tuesday in a city winding down toward New Year's Eve. But sitting at my desk with these pages spread before me, I felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. I pulled out my phone, took photos of each page under different lighting conditions. Then I opened my laptop and started cross-referencing the text against every known Nostradamus quatrain. Nothing matched. These were completely original, unpublished, uncatalogued, which meant either I'd made the discovery of the century or someone had created the most elaborate forgery I'd ever encountered. I needed to translate them. Needed to know what they said. Nostradamus wrote in a deliberately obscure style, mixing Old French with Latin, Greek, and Italian, using anagrams and wordplay to obscure his meaning. Translating his work wasn't just about language. It required understanding Renaissance symbolism, astrological references, and the political context of 16th century France. I grabbed my reference books, stacking them beside my laptop. A Latin dictionary, a Middle French lexicon, a treatise on astrological symbolism, my own notes from years of research. Made a pot of coffee, the cheap stuff from the bodega downstairs, burnt and bitter, but effective. Settled in for what I knew would be a long night. The first page contained 4 quatrains, each 4 lines long in Nostradamus's typical format. But unlike his published prophecies, which jumped between centuries and continents without warning, these 4 quatrains seemed to form a sequence, a timeline. I started with the first one, working line by line, word by word. Quand le feu du soleil frappe les tours modernes. When the fire of the sun strikes the modern towers. I paused. Modern towers was a strange phrase for Nostradamus. He usually avoided contemporary references, preferring timeless symbolism. But here he was being specific, almost like he was trying to ensure future readers would understand. I continued translating, my coffee growing cold beside me, my back developing a persistent ache that I ignored. The quatrain described a catastrophe from the heavens, not judgment, not divine intervention, but something natural and inevitable. The sun's fury reaching earth, lightning that never stops, the learned men's tools becoming tombs of metal and glass. By the time I'd translated the full quatrain, my hands had started shaking again. This was describing a solar storm, a massive coronal mass ejection, a CME, hitting Earth's magnetic field with enough force to overwhelm it completely. I opened a new browser tab, searching for scientific papers on solar weather. Found a NASA report from 2019 warning about the possibility of a Carrington event, named after the massive solar storm that hit Earth in 1859, back when our electrical infrastructure consisted of telegraph wires. That storm had melted telegraph equipment, started fires, and produced auroras visible at the equator. If a similar storm hit now, in our hyper-connected digital age, the damage would be catastrophic. I kept reading, finding report after report. Scientists had been warning for years. The power grid wasn't shielded. Satellites weren't protected. A direct hit from a massive CME could destroy transformers across entire continents, and we didn't have enough replacement stockpiled. Repairs could take years. But the power grid was just the beginning. No power meant no water treatment plants, no fuel pumps, no refrigeration for medicine or food, no internet, no phones, no GPS. Everything we'd built our civilization on, gone in an instant. I looked back at Nostradamus's quatrain. The next line was even more specific. Toute lumière meurt sauf le feu, et le monde retourne aux ténèbres anciennes. All light dies except fire, and the world returns to ancient shadows. Then the final couplet, which made my stomach turn. Les savants promettent des décennies pour réparer, mais les mois avant destruction ne permettent aucun espoir. The learned promise decades to repair, but months before destruction allow no hope. Months. He'd said months. I pulled up more research. Found a Department of Homeland Security report estimating that without power, water, or supply chains, major cities would descend into chaos within weeks. The CDC projected massive death tolls from lack of medical care within months. And all of this assumed we had time to rebuild. But if something else happened during those months of vulnerability? I noticed something in the margin of the page. Small notations in a darker ink, added later. Mathematical symbols I didn't initially recognize. I grabbed my magnifying glass, examining them more closely. They were astronomical calculations, planetary positions, specific dates. My breath caught. If I was reading these correctly, Nostradamus had pinpointed when this solar event would occur. February 2026, early in the year, less than 6 weeks away. I pushed back from my desk, my chair rolling until it hit the bookshelf behind me. This was insane. Nostradamus couldn't have predicted solar activity 5 centuries in advance. The science didn't exist. The understanding didn't exist, unless he'd extrapolated from patterns. The sun's activity follows cycles, roughly 11 years between peaks. If Nostradamus had access to historical records of auroras and solar storms, if he'd been a better mathematician than we'd ever given him credit for? No. This was confirmation bias. I was seeing what I wanted to see, connecting dots that weren't really there. But what if I wasn't? I looked at the remaining pages spread across my desk. 11 more pages, 3 more prophecies if the pattern held. 3 more catastrophes, all targeting the same year, 2026. I checked my phone. 11:47 p.m. December 30th, sliding toward December 31st. Tomorrow would be New Year's Eve. People would celebrate, drink champagne, make resolutions they wouldn't keep. They'd count down to midnight, kissing strangers and singing Auld Lang Syne, welcoming 2026 with hope and optimism. And I sat here, in my cluttered apartment above a used bookstore, staring at 500-year-old parchment that claimed their optimism was misplaced. I should stop, go to bed, get some sleep, approach this fresh in the morning with a clear head and healthy skepticism. Instead, I reached for the second page, because I had to know, had to understand what came after the lights went out, had to see what Nostradamus believed would emerge from the ancient shadows he'd described. The second page felt colder than the first when I picked it up, though that was probably my imagination. The temperature in my apartment hadn't changed. The radiator still clanked and hissed in the corner. The refrigerator still hummed in the kitchenette. But my fingers had gone numb, and not from cold. I positioned the page under my lamp, started translating the first line of the second prophecy. Quand l'obscurité règne et les tours sont tombées. When shroud covers all and the towers have fallen. I paused, struck by the phrasing. This wasn't just a new prophecy. This was a continuation, a sequence of events, each building on the last. First, the solar storm destroys our technology. Then, in the chaos that follows, I kept translating, working through the archaic French and obscure symbolism. My coffee had gone completely cold, a film forming on the surface. Outside, someone was playing music, bass-heavy hip-hop that rattled my windows. Normal city sounds, normal life. But the words I was translating described the end of normal life as we knew it. The second quatrain spoke of seeds that cannot be seen, an enemy that travels on breath, death that comes in days but spreads in hours, healers who become carriers, hospitals that transform into tombs, a plague, a pandemic, but not just any disease. The third line was specific. Pire que la mort noire, rapide comme le vent, aucun ne sera épargné. Worse than the Black Death, swift as wind, none shall be spared. My mind raced through history. The Black Death had killed maybe a third of Europe's population. What could be worse? What could move faster? Modern diseases, I realized, with modern travel. Before the solar storm, a pandemic could spread globally in days via air travel. But after the storm, with the world's infrastructure crippled, containment would be impossible. No rapid testing, no vaccine development, no coordinated response. And people would be traveling, fleeing destroyed cities, searching for food and water, gathering in survivor communities, perfect conditions for a contagion to spread exponentially. I found more margin notes on this page, medical symbols mixed with astrological signs, and a phrase written in Latin, morbus ex tenebris natus, disease born from shadows. What did that mean? A disease that emerged because of the darkness? Or a disease that had been waiting in the shadows, and the collapse of civilization simply allowed it to spread unchecked? The final couplet of the second prophecy chilled me to my core. En 3 mois, la moitié tombera. En 6 mois, le monde sera méconnaissable. Ceux qui restent enverront les morts. In 3 months, half will fall. In 6 months, the world will be unrecognizable. Those who remain will envy the dead. I sat back, my desk lamp casting harsh shadows across the parchment. 2 prophecies, 2 catastrophes, both targeting 2026, both building on each other in a cascade of horrors. First, technology dies. Then, in the vulnerable chaos, a pandemic strikes. But there were still 2 more pages, 2 more prophecies. And if the pattern held, they would get worse. My apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. I stood, walked to the window, stared out at Baltimore's nighttime skyline. Lights everywhere. Streetlights, building lights, the red glow of cell towers. All of it dependent on a grid that could be destroyed in seconds by particles from the sun. All of it taken for granted. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. My reflection stared back at me, ghostly and unfamiliar. When had I last slept? When had I last eaten something that wasn't delivered or microwaved? My ex-wife's voice echoed in my memory. You're going to work yourself to death, Craig. And for what? So your name can be on some paper that 12 people will read? I told her she didn't understand. That the work mattered. That understanding history meant understanding humanity. But standing at my window at midnight on December 30th, staring at the city lights while translating prophecies of doom, I wondered if maybe she'd been right. Maybe I should put the pages away, go to bed, wake up tomorrow and sell them to a collector. Make enough money to pay rent for a few months. Let someone else worry about whether they were real or fake. My hands went to the 3rd page anyway, because I'd already seen too much to stop now, already knew too much to sleep peacefully. And because somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible certainty was growing. These prophecies weren't forgeries. They were warnings. And I had less than 2 months to figure out what to do about them. The 2nd page trembled in my hands. Not from any supernatural force, just exhaustion and caffeine and the growing weight of what I was reading. My fingers had gone numb from the cold since I'd opened the window, but I couldn't bring myself to close it. Needed the fresh air. Needed something to remind me the world outside still existed. My laptop showed 12:03 a.m. Officially, December 31st now. New Year's Eve, the last one before 2026. Outside my window, someone set off fireworks early. A string of crackling pops that made me flinch. Through the glass, I watched sparks cascade over the row houses across the street, momentarily painting the night in reds and golds before dissolving into smoke. I could hear distant laughter, music from an apartment party somewhere below. People were celebrating, getting ready for parties, buying champagne, planning where they'd be at midnight, welcoming the new year with hope and optimism. And I sat here with a 500-year-old manuscript describing how half of them would be dead by summer. I set the 1st page aside carefully, positioned the 2nd page under my magnifying lamp. The parchment was slightly thicker than the 1st, the vellum prepared differently. Little details I'd learned to notice during years of handling historical documents. Little details that suddenly seemed obscenely trivial compared to what the document contained. I began translating, my pen scratching across notebook paper as I worked through the archaic French word by word. Quand l'obscurité règne et les tours sont tombées, les graines invisibles s'envolent. When darkness reigns and the towers have fallen, invisible seeds take flight. Invisible seeds. I paused, considering the metaphor. In the 16th century, people didn't understand germ theory. Wouldn't for another 300 years. Disease was attributed to miasmas, bad air, divine punishment. But here Nostradamus was describing something that spread through invisible particles, seeds that flew through the air, that people couldn't see. That could be anywhere, everywhere, carried on breath and touch. A pathogen. A virus or bacteria so contagious it would spread like wildfire through a population that had no way to detect or contain it. I continued translating, finding descriptions that made my medical knowledge, such as it was, scream warnings. Voyage sur le souffle avant que les signes apparaissent. Travels on breath before signs appear. Asymptomatic transmission. The infected spreading disease before they even knew they were sick. That was nightmare fuel for any epidemiologist. It meant quarantine was nearly useless. By the time you identified a case, dozens or hundreds of others had already been exposed. Frappe jeunes et vieux avec une fureur égale. Strikes young and old with equal fury. Most diseases showed demographic patterns. The very young and very old were vulnerable, but healthy adults typically survived. But this disease didn't discriminate. Didn't spare the strong or the prepared. Equal opportunity death. I stood from my desk, needing to move. My apartment suddenly felt claustrophobic. I walked to the kitchenette, opened the refrigerator, stared at the nearly empty shelves. Grabbed a beer, drank half of it standing there. The cold helped. Cleared my head slightly. I returned to my desk, to the prophecy that described how billions would die. The next stanza was medical in its precision. Les guérisseurs deviennent des vecteurs. Les hôpitaux deviennent des tombeaux. Healers become vectors, hospitals become tombs. Of course, healthcare workers would be exposed first, would try to help, to treat the sick, and in doing so would become infected themselves, would carry the disease to other patients, other facilities. The very places people fled to for safety would become concentration points for infection. And after the solar storm destroyed the power grid, hospitals would be crippled anyway. No electricity for ventilators, surgical equipment. No refrigeration for medicines, no sterilization. They would revert to pre-industrial conditions, candlelight and prayer, and they would overflow with the dying, with the... I found margin notes on this page, small annotations in darker ink, medical symbols, astrological signs, and a phrase in Latin, morbus ex tenebris natus, disease born from darkness. What did that mean? A disease that emerged because of the darkness caused by the solar storm? Or a disease that had been hiding all along, waiting for civilization to collapse? I thought about zoonotic diseases, how most pandemics throughout history had originated from animal populations. Bubonic plague from rats, influenza from birds. How many unknown pathogens were out there right now, separated from humanity by only the thinnest barriers? And what would happen when those barriers broke down? When people fled cities after the solar storm, moving into rural areas, hunting wildlife, living in close contact with animals in unsanitary conditions. Disease born from darkness, not supernatural. Just the natural consequence of civilizational collapse. The third stanza provided a timeline that made me reach for my beer again. En 3 mois, la moitié tombera. En 6 mois, le monde sera méconnaissable. In 3 months, half will fall. In 6 months, the world will be unrecognizable. I did the math. If the solar storm hit in February 2026 and the pandemic emerged in March, which made sense, people fleeing cities, breaking quarantines, desperate for resources, then by May, half of humanity would be dead. 4 billion people, gone in 90 days. The Black Death killed maybe a third of Europe over 5 years. This would be twice as deadly in a fraction of the time. And by August, 6 months after it started, the world would be unrecognizable, billions of bodies with no one to bury them, cities abandoned, infrastructure collapsed, governments dissolved, supply chains broken beyond repair. The entire edifice of modern civilization reduced to scattered bands of survivors, each one potentially carrying infection to the next. I pulled up WHO documents on my laptop, found warnings about disease X, their term for an unknown pathogen that could cause the next pandemic. Found papers discussing how modern travel could spread a novel virus globally within days under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. These were conditions where the entire system of disease monitoring and response had been destroyed. No rapid testing, no vaccine development, no coordinated international response. Just people fleeing, hiding, dying. The final couplet was almost casual in its aura. Ceux qui restent environ les morts, car la souffrance qui vient sera pire que toute peste. Those who remain will envy the dead, for the suffering to come will be worse than any plague. Worse than the plague itself. What could be worse than watching billions die from disease? I looked at the third page sitting on my desk, already dreading what it would say, already knowing that each prophecy would be worse than the last, but I couldn't stop now. Had to understand the full scope of what Nostradamus had seen. I checked the time. 1:47 a.m. Had I really spent nearly 2 hours on just one prophecy? I stood again, walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. I returned to my desk. The third page waited. After the solar storm destroys technology, after the pandemic kills billions, what happens to the survivors? They fight. Of course they fight. They go to war. I picked up the third page with hands that had stopped shaking. Not because I'd calmed down. I was beyond calm, beyond panic. I'd entered some numb zone where horror became abstract. This page was in worse condition than the first two. Water damage had blurred entire words along the right margin. There was a dark stain in the upper corner, rust-colored, organic-looking. Someone had handled this page roughly. Or Nostradamus himself had been distraught when writing it. I began translating the first line. Quand la moitié est morte et les ténèbres règnent, les survivants se battent pour des miettes. When half are dead and darkness reigns, survivors fight over scraps. Not a new prophecy. A continuation. The timeline was sequential. First the solar storm, then the pandemic. Then, in the aftermath, war. The second line confirmed it. Frère contre frère, nation contre nation, la troisième grande guerre commence. Brother against brother, nation against nation. The third great war begins. World War III. But not the war we'd imagined during the Cold War. This would be slower, more brutal, more primitive. I continued translating. Nostradamus described how the war would start not with grand declarations or formal alliances, but with desperation. With nations realizing their neighbors had recovered faster from the solar storm, had working infrastructure, had food supplies, had medicine, and with half the world's population dead from plague, morality becomes a luxury no one can afford. Les nations qui se relèvent les premières de la foudre divine domineront les faibles. Nations that recover first from the divine lightning will dominate the weak. I thought about which countries that might be. Russia still maintained Soviet-era infrastructure, hardened, low-tech, built to survive nuclear war. Much of it analog, less dependent on delicate electronics. China had massive manufacturing capability and an authoritarian government that could mobilize resources efficiently, could enforce order when others descended into chaos. India had experience operating under challenging conditions. Maybe parts of South America, less dependent on complex supply chains. The United States? We'd be crippled. Our military was the most technologically advanced in the world, which meant it was also the most vulnerable to a solar storm. GPS-guided munitions would be useless. Satellite communications gone, drones grounded. Our entire force structure designed around precision warfare that required functioning electronics. We'd have to fight like it was 1945, or 1918, and we weren't prepared for that. The next stanza confirmed my fears. La guerre est menée non pas avec des machines volantes, mais avec des hommes dans la boue. The war is fought not with flying machines, but with men in mud. Trench warfare, artillery bombardments, infantry charges, chemical weapons deployed because precision munitions no longer existed. Nostradamus used a phrase that haunted me. Boue et sang. Mud and blood. He described battles that lasted weeks, thousands dying for miles of territory. Cities destroyed not by smart bombs but by sustained shelling. Civilian populations caught between armies, starving, diseased, desperate. The margin notes on this page were different. Less medical, more strategic. Crude diagrams showing movement of forces, and dates suggesting this war would begin in late summer or early fall of 2026. After the pandemic had run its course, after the survivors had buried their dead, that's when the fighting would begin. When people were weakest, most vulnerable, most desperate. I stood from my desk, paced to the window. Outside, the city was quieter now. Past 2 a.m., even the party below had died down to occasional laughter and muffled music. I could see a couple walking their dog, the animal sniffing at a lamppost, completely oblivious to the weight of knowledge pressing down on me. Normal life continuing, normal routines, normal assumptions about tomorrow. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Tried to imagine what I was reading. Tried to picture September 2026. Armies fighting over cornfields and water treatment plants. Chemical weapons drifting across battlefields. Artillery fire destroying what the pandemic and collapse hadn't already ruined. Millions more dying after billions had already fallen to disease, and it would last months. The prophecy was clear about that. Spring into summer into fall, battles raging across continents as nations fought for survival. For what? For the privilege of inheriting a dying world? But it was the final stanza that made me return to my desk, hands shaking again. La guerre se termine quand le feu des montagnes endormies est réveillé par la colère des hommes. The war ends when fire from sleeping mountains is awakened by the wrath of men. Sleeping mountains. I knew what he meant. I pulled up a browser window with fingers that barely cooperated. Typed, Yellowstone supervolcano. Found the USGS page. Yellowstone sits atop one of the largest volcanic systems on Earth. A magma chamber 40 miles across, partially molten. It's erupted catastrophically 3 times. The last major eruption was 640,000 years ago. Scientists monitor it constantly. The consensus is, it's not due for another eruption for hundreds of thousands of years, unless something triggered it artificially. I found a declassified Department of Defense paper from 2019. Theoretical scenarios for environmental warfare. How a nuclear device placed at the right location over Yellowstone's magma chamber could potentially trigger an eruption. The paper concluded it was strategically insane. A Yellowstone eruption wouldn't just destroy the United States, it would devastate the entire world. Ash in the stratosphere would block sunlight, creating volcanic winter that could last years. It would be suicide. Unless you were already losing. Unless your nation was being invaded, your people slaughtered. Unless you decided that if you were going down, you'd take everyone else with you. I returned to Nostradamus's text, found the description of the aftermath. Le ciel devient cendre. Le soleil disparaît derrière un voile gris qui ne se lève pas. The sky becomes ash. The sun disappears behind a grey veil that does not lift. Les récoltes meurent dans les champs. Le froid arrive même en été. Et ceux qui ont survécu à la peste et à la guerre meurent de faim dans l'obscurité. Harvests die in the fields. Cold comes even in summer, and those who survived plague and war starve in the darkness. I pulled up scientific papers on volcanic winter, found models of what a VEI-8 eruption would do. Yellowstone had produced such eruptions before, the most recent 640,000 years ago. That eruption had covered half of North America in ash several feet deep, had affected climate globally for years. A modern eruption would be worse. Not because the volcano would be more powerful, but because humanity was more vulnerable. We had 8 billion mouths to feed, all dependent on industrial agriculture, all dependent on predictable weather patterns and growing seasons, all dependent on just-in-time supply chains that would shatter the moment the ash started falling. The paper's estimated temperatures could drop 10 to 15 degrees Celsius globally. Growing seasons would be cut in half or eliminated entirely in many regions. The ash cloud could persist for 3 to 5 years before settling enough for sunlight to return. 3 to 5 years without agriculture, with half the world already dead from plague, with infrastructure destroyed by the solar storm, with no international cooperation or aid because there would be no functioning international community left. People would starve, billions of them. The survivors would fight over canned goods, stored grain, anything that could sustain life, would kill their neighbors for a bag of rice, a jar of preserves, would resort to cannibalism when everything else ran out. The papers mentioned this possibility clinically, academically. In extended volcanic winter scenarios lasting multiple years, researchers project that survival strategies would likely include consumption of human remains. Sanitized language for the horror of eating your neighbor's corpse. I found the final line, nearly invisible beneath water damage. Had to angle the page under the light. Quand le 12e mois de cette année terrible commence, seulement un homme sur 100 respire encore, et ceux-là envient les morts. When the 12th month of this terrible year begins, only 1 man in 100 still draws breath, and those envy the dead. December 2026. 1% of humanity remaining. 80 million out of 8 billion. The worst extinction event in human history, and all of it happening in a single year. 10 months from solar storm to volcanic winter. February to December. I sat back in my chair. My apartment was completely silent now. The party had ended. The music had stopped. Even the traffic outside had thinned to nothing. The city sleeping, unaware. Just me and these pages and the unbearable weight of what they described. My laptop screen had dimmed to save power. I tapped the trackpad, saw the time. 3:47 a.m. December 31st, 2025. In less than 21 hours, people would gather in Times Square and cities across America, would count down from 10, would scream and cheer and kiss strangers, would welcome 2026 with fireworks and hope. The last day of the last year of human civilization as we knew it. If the prophecies were real, if that word carried so much weight, if these were genuine, if Nostradamus had actually calculated this, if the solar storm really would hit in February, if everything cascaded as described. So many ifs. But each one supported by real science, real warnings, real risks that experts had been flagging for years. I stood, walked to my bathroom, turned on the tap, splashed cold water on my face until my skin went numb, looked in the mirror at a stranger, hollow-eyed, unshaven, hair wild. I looked like a man having a breakdown, a man who'd lost touch with reality. Maybe I had. Maybe these were forgeries, and I'd spent the entire night falling for an elaborate hoax. Maybe in the morning I'd see how ridiculous this all was, how my desperation for academic relevance, for one last significant discovery, had made me vulnerable to confirmation bias, had made me see patterns that weren't there, connections that didn't exist. But I didn't think so. I thought about the details, the specificity, the way each disaster created conditions for the next with inexorable logic, the alignment with real scientific risks, solar storms we knew were possible, pandemics experts warned about constantly, geopolitical tensions that could explode into war, volcanic threats monitored daily. Nostradamus hadn't predicted supernatural disasters. He'd calculated natural ones, had mapped out how human nature and natural catastrophe would interact, had understood that civilizations, like any complex system, had cascading failure modes, had seen that once the cascade began, each collapse made the next one not just possible but inevitable. It was brilliant. Terrifying, but brilliant. I returned to my desk, looked at the 3 pages I'd translated. Solar storm, pandemic, war and volcanic winter. 3 catastrophes that would reduce humanity from 8 billion to 80 million in 10 months. 3 prophecies down, 1 to go. And my eyes drifted to the 4th page. There was one more prophecy, one more disaster that would kill the final 1%. What could be worse than everything I'd already read? The 4th page was different from the others, cleaner, less damaged. The handwriting appeared more controlled, as if Nostradamus had been calmer when writing this one, or perhaps more resigned. I noticed symbols in the margins I hadn't seen on the other pages. Not astrological signs or religious iconography. Something else. Geometric patterns. Mathematical notation. I grabbed my phone, did a reverse image search on similar symbols. Found matches in papers about Renaissance proto-science. About theoretical work on matter and particles. About early concepts of mechanisms that operated at scales invisible to human perception. One match made my blood go cold. An illustration from a 1556 alchemical manuscript describing corpuscula machinae, tiny machines. The text theorized about devices smaller than grains of sand that could manipulate matter, could break down and rebuild substances at fundamental levels. Renaissance scholars imagining nanotechnology 4 centuries before Richard Feynman would give his famous "There's plenty of room at the bottom" lecture. 4 centuries before anyone would build the first actual nanoscale devices. And Nostradamus had drawn similar diagrams in the margins of his prophecy. Had seen somehow what came after the volcanic winter. What killed the last survivors. What ended not just humanity, but all life on Earth. My hands started shaking again. I looked at the 4th page, at the neat script waiting to be translated. At the strange symbols that suggested Nostradamus had been trying to describe something beyond his era's ability to comprehend. And I realized I was afraid, not of dying, not of the end of the world, but of knowing, of carrying knowledge that would change everything. Once I translated this final prophecy, there would be no going back, no pretending I hadn't seen it. I would know how humanity ended. My phone buzzed, making me jump. A text from my ex-wife. "Happy almost New Year. Hope you're doing okay." I started typing, "Thanks, you too." Deleted it. Tried again. Tried. "I'm fine. Working on something." Deleted that. Finally just wrote, "Thanks. Hope 2026 is good for you." The lie felt heavy. But what was I supposed to say? I set my phone down. Looked at the 4th page again. I could stop. Could put the pages away. Go to bed. Forget about them. But I knew I wouldn't. Because I'd already come this far. Already seen too much. I picked up the 4th page. The parchment was smoother than the others, the ink darker. Whatever came next, whatever killed the last 1% of humanity after they'd survived everything else, I was about to find out. I positioned the page under my lamp and began to translate the end of the world. The first line of the 4th prophecy made me stop breathing. Après que les cendres couvrent le monde, et qu'un sur 100 respire encore. After ash covers the world, and 1 in 100 still draws breath. The continuation was unbroken, sequential, inexorable. First, the solar storm destroys technology. Then the pandemic kills billions. Then the war culminates in volcanic winter. And now this, the final catastrophe. Whatever kills the last 1% of humanity after they've survived everything else. The second line chilled me more than anything I'd read so far. Le vainqueur, dans sa victoire creuse, forge l'arme finale, les soldats qui ne peuvent être vus. The victor, in his hollow victory, forges the final weapon, soldiers that cannot be seen. Invisible soldiers. Nostradamus was describing something he couldn't possibly have understood. Something that wouldn't exist for 5 centuries. But here he was, trying to explain it using the only vocabulary available to a Renaissance physician. I continued translating, my pen moving almost automatically across the notebook paper. Ces machines plus petites que les graines de poussière, créées pour consommer la chair de l'ennemi. These machines smaller than grains of dust, created to consume the flesh of the enemy. Machines smaller than dust. Nostradamus had no word for nanometers, no concept of molecular engineering. But he'd seen it somehow. Had described self-replicating nanobots with startling accuracy given his limitations. Mais la victoire se transforme en malédiction, car les machines ne s'arrêtent pas. But victory transforms into curse, for the machines do not stop. That was the nightmare scenario. The gray goo hypothesis. Nanotechnology designed for a specific purpose, a weapon that malfunctions or exceeds its programming. Self-replication that doesn't shut off. Machines that consume organic matter to build more of themselves, exponentially, endlessly. I pulled up research papers with unsteady hands, found a 2018 Chinese military paper that had been leaked and quietly declassified. It discussed theoretical combat applications for nanoscale machines. The paper described weapons that could be deployed as aerosols, that could identify targets by biological markers, DNA, blood type, specific proteins. That could infiltrate the body at the cellular level and cause death that looked natural. Perfect assassination tools, perfect genocide machines. The paper concluded such weapons were decades away from development. Too many technical challenges, too many ethical barriers, too dangerous to pursue. But that assessment was from 2018, before the solar storm, before the pandemic, before the war, before civilization collapsed and ethics became a luxury no one could afford. In December 2026, with 99% of humanity dead, with nations fighting for survival over scraps, with no international oversight or moral constraints, someone would build it, would deploy it as a final weapon, and would lose control. I returned to the prophecy, found the description of what followed. Elles se propagent comme la peste, mais aucun feu ne peut les arrêter. Aucune lame ne peut les combattre. They spread like plague, but no fire can stop them. No blade can fight them. Elles dévorent toute chair vivante, transforment les hommes en poussière grise, puis les animaux, puis les plantes. They devour all living flesh, transform men to gray dust, then animals, then plants. I found papers on gray goo scenarios. Estimates of how fast unconstrained nanotech could replicate. The math was terrifying. Exponential growth starting with microscopic machines doubling every few minutes or hours, consuming biomass for raw materials. One researcher calculated that given optimal conditions, gray goo could convert the entire biosphere into more nanobots in less than 90 days. 3 months from deployment to complete sterilization of Earth. The next stanza was almost poetic in its horror. Le monde devient silencieux. Les oiseaux cessent de chanter. Les insectes cessent de bourdonner. Les vents soufflent sur une planète de pierre et de cendres. The world becomes silent. Birds cease singing. Insects cease buzzing. Winds blow across a planet of stone and ash. No more photosynthesis. No more food chains. No more ecosystems. Just rock and ash and the relentless machinery consuming itself when nothing organic remained. The finale couplet made my vision blur. Le dernier homme voit le dernier coucher de soleil à travers les cendres grises. Le lendemain, il n'y a plus personne. Plus d'animaux. Plus de plantes. Plus de vie. The last man sees the last sunset through gray ash. The next day there is no one, no more animals. No more plants, no more life. I set down my pen. The prophecy was complete. 4 catastrophes, 4 extinction-level events, each creating conditions for the next. A cascade so total, so absolute, that it would erase not just humanity, but all life on Earth. And all of it predicted for 2026. Starting in 6 weeks. My laptop showed 6:23 a.m. Full daylight now. December 31st, 2025. Outside my window, the city was waking up. I could hear garbage trucks rumbling past, car doors slamming, someone shouting about parking. Normal sounds. A normal morning. The last normal morning before the year that Nostradamus claimed would destroy us. I had to do something. Couldn't just sit here with this knowledge. Couldn't stay silent. But an academic paper wouldn't work. Would take months to publish. Would go through peer review that would tear it apart. Would reach maybe a few hundred specialists who already knew about these risks. By the time it saw print, the solar storm could have already hit. I needed something faster. Something that could reach people directly. Something immediate and accessible. A video. I could make a video. The thought seemed absurd. Me, exhausted and disheveled, filming myself talking about ancient prophecies. I'd be dismissed instantly as another internet crank. But what other option did I have? I spent the next 3 hours making myself presentable. Showered for the first time in 2 days. Shaved carefully. Found a clean button-down shirt. Made myself look as professional as possible. Then I set up my phone on a stack of books, positioned it to capture both me and my desk, adjusted the lamp for proper lighting, arranged the manuscript pages where the camera could see them clearly. By 9:30 a.m., I was ready. I hit record. My name is Craig Flynn. I have a PhD in Renaissance history from Georgetown University, where I specialized in the authentication and interpretation of historical prophecies. I've spent 15 years debunking false predictions and identifying forgeries. I paused, made sure I was speaking clearly despite the exhaustion. 3 days ago, I purchased a collection of documents at an estate sale in Baltimore. What I found has kept me up for the past 30 hours straight. I've translated what appear to be 4 lost prophecies by Michel de Nostradamus, all describing catastrophic events predicted for 2026. I held up the first page, angled it so the camera could capture the aged parchment, the Renaissance script. I approached these documents with extreme skepticism. My entire career has been built on exposing fraudulent prophecies, but what I've found is either the most sophisticated forgery ever created, or a genuine warning about events that could begin in just 6 weeks. I walked through each prophecy methodically, showed my translations, reading them aloud, explained the symbolism and historical context, but framed everything as historical analysis that happened to align with modern scientific warnings. The first prophecy describes a massive solar storm, a coronal mass ejection, that overwhelms Earth's magnetic field and destroys our electrical infrastructure. NASA has been warning about this possibility for over a decade. The power grid isn't designed to withstand such an event. We don't have enough replacement transformers stockpiled. Recovery could take years, not months. I pulled up a NASA report on my laptop, showed it to the camera, pointed to specific passages about the 1859 Carrington event and how a similar storm today would be catastrophic. In 1859, a solar storm melted telegraph wires and started fires. If that happened today, With our complex electrical systems, the damage would be unimaginable. That's not prophecy. That's physics. That's documented science. I move to the second prophecy. The second prophecy describes a pandemic emerging in the chaos after the solar storm. A disease that spreads asymptomatically, kills with high efficiency, and overwhelms healthcare systems. The WHO has been warning about Disease X, an unknown pathogen that could cause the next global pandemic. Without functioning hospitals, without coordination, without modern medicine, such a disease could kill billions. These aren't my words. These are the assessments of epidemiologists and public health experts. I showed WHO documents, CDC reports, papers on pandemic preparedness gaps. Made it clear I wasn't inventing these risks. I was reporting what experts had been saying for years. Again, this isn't mysticism. This is epidemiology. We know these risks exist. We've seen what happens when pandemics hit unprepared populations. We've been warned, repeatedly. And we've underfunded our response systems anyway. The third prophecy was harder to explain without sounding alarmist, so I was extra careful to present it as academic analysis. The third prophecy describes a global war fought after billions have died from plague. Nostradamus describes warfare reverting to early 20th century tactics. No satellites, no smart weapons, just artillery and infantry. This makes logical sense if the solar storm has destroyed our technology. The prophecy also describes the war ending when sleeping mountains awaken, which I interpret, based on the context and surrounding imagery, as a reference to volcanic eruption triggered by nuclear weapons. Specifically, the prophecy seems to describe what could happen if someone targeted Yellowstone. I pulled up the declassified Department of Defense paper, read excerpts carefully. This isn't fantasy or science fiction. Military strategists have analyzed scenarios where geological formations could be weaponized. A nuclear device detonated at a specific location over Yellowstone could potentially trigger a catastrophic eruption. The paper concluded it would be suicidal. The resulting volcanic winter would devastate the entire planet, attacker included. But in a losing war, with billions already dead and nothing left to lose, someone might do it anyway. That's not prophecy. That's game theory. That's the dark logic of mutually assured destruction. The fourth prophecy describes what Nostradamus calls invisible soldiers, machines smaller than dust that consume flesh. He couldn't possibly have understood nanotechnology in the 16th century, but he's describing it with remarkable accuracy given his limitations. He's describing the gray goo scenario that nanotechnology researchers have warned about for decades. Self-replicating nanobots that consume organic matter and can't be stopped once deployed. I showed the Chinese military research paper, explained it carefully. In a world with functioning international oversight and ethical constraints, we probably won't build such weapons. But after civilization collapses, after 99% of humanity is dead, when nations are fighting for survival with no rules left, someone would try anything. Someone would build it, and it would be impossible to contain. I paused, let that sink in, then continued. Here's what I want you to understand. Whether these prophecies are genuine or not, whether Nostradamus actually wrote them or someone created an elaborate forgery, every single risk they describe is real. Every catastrophe is scientifically possible. We have experts warning us about all of these threats, and we're not listening. I leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera with as much conviction as I could muster. Nostradamus didn't predict the future through magic or divine vision. If these documents are genuine, he calculated it. He was a physician, an astrologer, a mathematician. He had access to centuries of historical records, records of solar storms and their effects, records of plagues and how they spread, records of wars and what triggers them. He understood how civilizations collapse, how disasters cascade, how human nature responds to crisis. And he extrapolated forward, using the tools available to him. That's not prophecy in the supernatural sense. That's applied probability theory. It's what climate scientists do when they model future warming. What pandemic researchers do when they estimate outbreak scenarios. What military planners do when they game out potential conflicts. The only question is whether his calculations 5 centuries ago were accurate. I held up the 4 pages one more time, let the camera focus on them. I don't know if these events will happen. I genuinely don't. I hope they won't. I hope I'm wasting your time with an elaborate historical curiosity that has no predictive value. But I do know we're unprepared for any of these catastrophes individually, let alone all four in sequence. So whether you believe in Nostradamus or not, whether you think these are genuine prophecies or clever forgeries, ask yourself, are we ready for a major solar storm? Have we adequately funded pandemic preparedness? Are we doing enough to prevent escalating international conflicts? Are we thinking carefully about the risks and unintended consequences of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and nanotechnology? If the answer is no, and I believe it is, then maybe these old pages are valuable regardless of their authenticity. Maybe they're a reminder that catastrophe doesn't require supernatural forces or divine punishment. It just requires human complacency. It just requires us ignoring warnings until it's too late. I ended the recording, sat back, played it through once more to check for any obvious errors. I looked exhausted in the frame, couldn't hide that, but I sounded credible, rational, had presented evidence without sensationalism, had acknowledged uncertainty while making clear the risks were real. I spent another 2 hours editing, added graphics showing the timeline, inserted citations for every scientific paper I referenced, with links in the description. By 3:15 p.m., it was ready. December 31st, 2025. Out my window, I could see people carrying bags from the liquor store, everyone preparing for tonight's celebrations, and I was preparing to upload a video telling them their celebrations might be premature. This would destroy my academic reputation. No university would hire me. No journal would publish my work. But if I was wrong, I'd just be another failed academic. If I was right, reputation wouldn't matter. I clicked upload. Titled the video, Lost Nostradamus Prophecies Align with Scientific Warnings About 2026 Catastrophes, Historical Analysis. Posted it everywhere. Posted it. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit. Sent the link to journalists. Tagged scientists. The video went live at 2:14 p.m. I watched the view counter tick upward. Slowly at first. 23 views. 53. 200 by 4 p.m. Comments started appearing. Another doomsday cult LOL. Actually, the solar storm risks are legit. NASA has warned about CMEs. I work in pandemic preparedness. The disease profile he describes matches our worst-case scenarios exactly. Who is this guy? That last one caught my attention. A real researcher at Johns Hopkins. My phone buzzed. A text from my ex-wife. Craig, I just watched your video. Are you okay? Please call me. I didn't call. Instead, I opened my email. Messages from journalists. A professor at MIT, someone from NASA's Space Weather Prediction Center. They all wanted to see the original documents. I wrote careful responses, attached high-resolution photographs, made myself available for verification. By 8 p.m., the video had 12,000 views. By 10 p.m., it started climbing faster, 41,000. A climate scientist with 1 million followers had shared it. News outlets picking it up. Professor claims lost Nostradamus prophecies predict 2026 apocalypse. 10:47 p.m. Just over an hour until midnight. Over an hour. I stood from my desk, walked to my window. Outside, crowds were gathering. People heading to parties. I could hear music, laughter, anticipation building. In Times Square, 1 million people would be waiting to watch the ball drop. And I stood here with my translations and my evidence and my growing conviction that they were celebrating the beginning of the end. Unless I was wrong. Unless these were forgeries. I wanted to be wrong. Desperately wanted it. But the evidence kept nagging at me. The details. The way each disaster created conditions for the next. The alignment with real warnings. What if Nostradamus had actually done it? Had actually mapped out human extinction? Not through supernatural power, but through observation and analysis. 11:54 p.m., 6 minutes until 2026. I returned to my window, opened it despite the cold. Could hear the crowds below, the countdown beginning. 10, 9, 8. I thought about the solar storm predicted for February. 7, 6, 5. About the pandemic, the war, the volcanic winter, the nanobots. 4, 3, 2, 1. The crowd erupted. Fireworks exploded. People screamed and cheered. 2026 had begun. I stood at my window, watching, feeling the weight of what I knew, hoping desperately that I was wrong, but preparing for the possibility that I was right. I closed my window, returned to my desk, opened a new document and continued writing. A survival guide. Preparations people could make. How to store water and food. How to preserve knowledge. If the lights went out in February, someone needed to have written this down. Outside, the fireworks continued. The crowds celebrated, and I wrote. Because that's what I did. Document, preserve, warn, hope for the best, prepare for the worst, and wait to see if the old prophet had been right one last time.